Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest in the Boston Globe's Op Talks. I'm Kimberly Atkins, Senior Opinion Writer for the Boston Globe, and these are talks that we have between members of our editorial board and leaders, including elected officials like our guest today, incoming Assistant Speaker of the House of Representatives, Catherine Clark of Massachusetts, as we discuss the Democratic agenda in the new Congress. But before we get started with that discussion, a word from our sponsor, Solomon McCone and Sensi. Dan Sensi is here to say a few words. Hi, Dan.
Hey, Kim. Thank you. And thank you to the Boston Globe and its political reporting team for its continued in-depth reporting and analysis of our 2020 elections and what they mean to the future of the United States. I'm Dan Sensi, CEO and managing partner of Solomon McCown and Sensi. We are a strategic communications firm providing senior level counsel to clients at the intersection of public policy and business. We are proud to partner with the Globe to bring thought leaders and independent conversations like this one to the virtual table. I'm especially honored today to present this conversation with Congresswoman Catherine Clark, Assistant Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. I've had the honor and privilege to know and work with Congresswoman Clark for many years, going back to her time in the State House and actually before. Throughout her years in public service, she has made her mark on the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and our country, fighting against wage discrimination and fighting for access to affordable childcare, paid family leave, quality education, and more. As Catherine says, when families succeed, America succeeds. Now, as the fourth highest ranking member of the U.S. House of Representatives and the House's second highest ranking female member ever, Congresswoman Clark will help Speaker Pelosi, President-elect Biden, and Vice President-elect Harris, feels good to say that, guide us through one of the most extraordinary moments in American history. We are so thrilled she could join us today to offer her thoughts on the days to come. From the final days of this current session, to managing a slim majority in the House next session, to working with the potential Democratic or a McConnell Republican-led Senate, to advancing the Biden-Harris agenda in 2021. Thank you, Representative Clark, for joining us this morning. Now I'll turn things back over to Kim.
Thank you so much, Dan, for that introduction. And just a note from our audience in our discussion today, all the questions that I will be posing to Congresswoman Clark were selected by me and also by you. Thank you all so much for submitting dozens of questions ahead of time for this discussion. I will save some time at the end to ask as many of your questions as I can. And I will also weave some in our discussion as we go along. So thank you for that. And with that, welcome, Congresswoman Clark. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you. Thank you for having me today.
Sure. And sorry we can't be in person at the Capitol as we usually are when we speak, but I'm glad that we can come together virtually. And so I want to start our discussion by asking you about this new role, Assistant Speaker in the House of Representatives, Assistant Speaker of the House of Representatives. What made you seek this leadership post? You were previously Vice Chair of the Democratic Caucus. What made you seek this role, and how will your role be different in this next Congress?
Well, thank you again for having me. And I am very excited to be part of the leadership team in this new capacity, because it really is an opportunity to bring the voices of my constituents and of the people of the Commonwealth to the leadership table to make sure that we are focusing with the Biden-Harris administration on their needs. Really a focus on those issues that folks talk about around their kitchen table that keep them up at night. And that will be a continuation of the work we did in the 116th Congress, making sure we're protecting the right to vote, making sure that women's work is valued and that we stop the loss of jobs and women leaving the workforce in droves during this pandemic, making sure we're making investments in infrastructure and creating good jobs, and at the same time addressing climate change and the peril that it puts our planet, our existence, and our economy in. And all of this is going to be an opportunity to do this work, to set this agenda by pulling on the diversity in our Democratic caucus in the House. We have elected an incredibly diverse membership that looks like America, but it's only a talking point unless we are pulling in those different life experiences and weaving that diversity into our agenda. And so that's the work that I am looking forward to. And it's going to be challenging, but it is also gives me great optimism about reshifting our priorities to focus back on American families.
And you're talking about the diversity of the Congress, of the Democratic caucus, but there has been some criticism about leadership in the House, that it has grown too stagnant and frankly too old, and that it doesn't necessarily reflect the diversity within the caucus. What do you say to that criticism?
Well, I see many dynamic leaders emerging in our caucus that also reflect the diversity of race, religion, gender, geography, and perspective that we want, so that we are setting policies that put the American people front and center and bring that together. And, you know, you mentioned that this is only the second time a woman has broken through the ranks of the top 4 in leadership. And I think that matters. And I see other women coming into leadership. And when we're at the table, it makes a difference. The priorities change. Those issues around childcare. And, you know, I remember in my job working for the state when I realized that my entire salary was going to childcare. And I was lucky that I had a spouse who was making a good income and we could make it past that. But having those experiences really informs and lets us bring those voices of American moms to the table, where we, you know, to just go back to looking at where women are right now. 1 in 4 women have left the workforce since the pandemic hit. And back in September, that was over 8,000 women left in that 1 month. And what does that mean? It means that we have failed to respect and value women's work. And this pandemic, like with so many other areas, has brought these inequities forward and brought them into stark relief. So our failure to make robust investments in childcare, our failure to make sure everybody has paid sick leave and paid family leave, that women earn the same amount when they do the same job as their male counterparts, and that their work is valued. Since we have not taken the action we need to take, it is now playing out in a devastating way. Those are issues that I can bring to the leadership table. Those are issues that we are going to need to address to not just bring our economy and our country back to status quo once we are able to crush this virus, but to build a more inclusive economy. And so I think these milestones of gender parity, of making sure that our leadership team reflects the country, are really ones that are key to making sure that we're passing the right agenda and that we are focusing on the right things.
And I want to ask some more questions and drill down on some of those policies and agenda items in just a moment. But first, the House, in the new Congress, the House will have a slimmer Democratic majority than it had before. Why do you think Democrats lost seats in the House in this last election? And how might that make the job to pass the agenda items we'll talk about even tougher?
Well, one thing that I am very excited about is that we have retained the majority and we're going to have a powerful new ally in the Biden-Harris administration. And that really is a game changer. We will see what happens in Georgia. I hope that we will have a majority in the Senate so that we can get to work on what we need to do to save lives as we pass this incredibly heartbreaking and grim milestone of 300,000 Americans who've lost their lives to this virus. But we know that those other issues are there, whether it's healthcare and making sure that we are supporting the ACA and expanding it and undoing the contraction and these efforts all the way to the Supreme Court to completely take away health insurance from tens of millions of Americans. So we have kept the majority, and we will do a deep dive into exactly what we did right or wrong in this election. But 80 million people voted for change, voted for Joe Biden, and said, let's restore integrity. Let's restore science and truth to the policies we pursue. And it's not just an academic issue. It's about finding solutions for Americans when we are seeing 1/3 of Americans unable to pay their bills. 40 million of our neighbors and friends and community members across this country are on the verge of homelessness. And in the wealthiest nation in the world, we are seeing our veterans, children, family members go hungry. 1 in 5 in Massachusetts are going to bed hungry. And we can do better than this. And it is going to take our focus. But this is an example of the work that we have been doing as Democrats in the House, and that we are going to extend with the Biden-Harris administration as a powerful ally.
So I want to talk about some of the agenda items that are in front of you and your colleagues. At the top of that is relief from the COVID pandemic. As we speak now, lawmakers are still trying to hammer out the details of what looks like it could be a compromise plan of about $900 billion to address this. What do you think needs to happen now? And will it be enough? It seems that this means that when you come into the new Congress, COVID relief will once again, even if this measure passes, be at the top of the agenda of what you have to do because it won't be enough.
That's absolutely right. What we know is we cannot get relief to the American people too fast, and we cannot give them too much relief. This has been our message since back in May when we passed the HEROES Act. And all of this suffering was very obvious what would happen, and it was preventable. But what we saw after passing that package that would have extended unemployment benefits, been able to stabilize people's homes and keep a roof over their heads, make sure that we are investing in our schools so they can be the safest place in our communities for our kids to learn and grow, making sure we're stabilizing childcare and looking ahead and funding this vaccine distribution that is giving us optimism and hope for the first time since this pandemic started. All of this we knew we needed back in May. And what we've seen is Mitch McConnell say to us, let's hit the pause button. Let's see how we fare. And it was very lonely at the negotiating table throughout the summer. And then we got to October, we passed another package that was smaller, that we hoped we could get to compromise on. And Mitch McConnell said, let's wait till after the election. So here we are in mid-December. I hope that this is an agreement that we can pass this week, and that by Friday, we can get life-saving funding to the American people. We have seen the death toll from this virus go up 60% in the last 2 weeks. And with that comes all the financial pain of loss of livelihood, as we have seen our businesses contract, our economy just experience devastation caused by this virus. So I am pleased that it looks like we are going to be able to get Mitch McConnell to yes, but there are painful trade-offs. But we have to do the basics. Make sure that the programs like unemployment and eviction moratoriums that are set to run out at the end of this month are extended. and that we give people a life-saving bridge to the Biden-Harris administration when their security and their health will be back as the priority of that new administration, which frankly, it just hasn't been. We have seen a White House and a president that is so obsessed with holding on to his own power that he has failed to see and address the suffering that we are seeing across communities in my district and across the country.
One of the sticking points is the push by Democratic lawmakers for increased state and local funding. Do you see that as a realistic measure, particularly right now when local states, where municipalities and states are ramping up to distribute the vaccine, which we are seeing the first doses being given this week? What are the priorities within that package that you see are important, and what are your concerns about some of those not being part of a final deal?
Well, my concern is that Mitch McConnell has chosen to try and keep workers out of courts while a majority of the GOP signs on to a fraudulent lawsuit about our elections and demands that these fraudulent claims have their day in court. So Mitch McConnell's been very clear that he will not support state and local aid unless we support exempting corporations from liability. And it really extends even beyond pandemic-related claims. And they have changed that standard or proposed to change that standard to one of gross negligence, which would mean a family or a worker would have to show that employer knew and wanted them to have the coronavirus, which is an incredibly difficult standard. And beyond that, they want to roll back workers' rights around OSHA and worker safety protections and regulations, civil rights, how we treat disabled people in the workplace. So this is using a pandemic to deny consumers and workers access to our courts. And the price for that was state and local aid. And it may be a price that we have to pay. All of this package, a $900 billion package, is a down payment on securing the lives and livelihoods of Americans. But we have been able within that package to put some funding for states that is going to be desperately needed. And we don't have the final numbers yet, but there will be money for vaccination distribution, for education, to help our schools, and to make sure that we are having some money for transportation projects as well. So there are going to be good things for state, but the funding for municipalities, the robust funding we need to give states, is going to fall way short because of Mitch McConnell's obsession with denying access to the courts for workers.
Now, I want to turn back to you. You talked about women and childcare. I know you have framed the need for childcare as a part of infrastructure. How do you move forward now in your new role in talking about things like healthcare beyond the pandemic? Obviously, that was one of the issues that was exacerbated by the pandemic. But even moving forward, how does childcare as infrastructure and the focus on women and families look in the next Congress?
Yeah, it is a tough time to be a woman and a mom in the workforce. You know, as I said earlier, just think about that statistic. 1 out of 4 women are being forced to leave the workforce, when we know that over 50% of our essential workers are nurses, our grocery store clerks. The people that we have relied on in this pandemic are women. And yet it shows that we have just failed to respect and to value the work of women. And childcare is a leading example. Childcare providers operated on the thinnest of margins in the best of times. And I think that we can look at the composition of that workforce for why that is. In Massachusetts, 92% of our providers are women, and over 40% of those women are people of color. So, you know, this is part of our history and part of what we have to keep pushing for. Let's make an economy that is truly inclusive. And a great place to start is by paying childcare providers the wages they need, the wages that they can use to support their own families. It was just about a year ago in a town hall in my district where I had childcare providers coming who were putting in 40, 50 hours a week, caring for our youngest learners, our children, our future, yet they were not making enough money to be able to support their own families without assistance from several programs. This is an outrage. And it is also true that childcare is one of the largest bills that families face in their budgets. And so we have a situation where we have to recognize, and I am heartened that the business community and that this is a bipartisan recognition that we are not going to have a recovery if we do not stabilize and invest in childcare, that there is going to be no way to rebound and to bring women back into our economy, back into the workforce, unless we have childcare that is affordable and accessible and pays those early educators a wage that they can live on. So we know how to do this. The research on the power of early education and quality childcare programs is immense. We have reams of data about the long-lasting impacts, and especially for children who are poor. We know that this is one of the greatest offsets to have children ready to learn when they get to school and be able to hit that critical milestone of reading at grade level by 3rd grade. So all of this is achievable, but we have to be intentional about it. And one of the areas that I am so excited about and looking forward to working with the Biden-Harris administration is their care agenda. Because when we are investing in a care agenda, we are investing in women. We are investing in American families and saying, we see how you're struggling. And we not only want to have a robust economy, but we want to help build that workforce of the future that our children represent.
I want to go quickly through some of the other priorities that are before the new Congress. One is criminal justice reform. Obviously, we saw the calls for racial justice throughout this year, even throughout the pandemic. But there's also been debate within the Democratic caucus about what that looks like and what the messaging should be like, even concerns by some Democrats that the calls to defund police actually cost Democrats seats in the House. What does criminal justice reform look like in the next Congress? Will that include things like the elimination of qualified immunity? What can we expect?
I think you can expect exactly what we did back in June in passing the George Floyd Policing Reform Act, which did change qualified immunity, which did ban chokeholds and no-knock warrants. And this is work that we're committed to. It passed overwhelmingly with Democrats in the House, and once again was stopped in the Senate and by President Trump. But this is work that has to be not just looking at police and how we can make sure that we are transforming our police from warriors to guardians, and that everybody feels the police are there to protect them. But we have to look at institutional racism in this country in every single policy we pass. I'm a big fan of Dr. Kendi and his cry to us to it is not enough just to not pass racist legislation, but do an analysis of every piece of work that we do, every policy that we are looking at to give solutions for the American people, and make sure that it is anti-racist. We have an opportunity, and the American people told us in November that this is our moment of racial and economic justice, and that we have to meet this point in history in our country and do it, with urgency and with thoughtfulness. And so that's going to be our mission, to not only, hopefully get all the way through with our police reform bill, but to also make sure that we are addressing racism and institutional racism in every piece of the work that we do. And childcare is, again, a great example. When you have a predominantly woman and women of color workforce, making sure that they earn wages that represent the incredibly critical work that they're doing is an issue of racial justice, as well as one of economic justice. So looking at that, how does everything impact, racial, economic, and climate justice are going to be the three touch points as we move forward with our agenda in the House.
I want to move to climate next. I know you've already led a letter to the incoming Biden administration seeking an executive order to ban single-use plastics. What else will you be pushing for? What are the chances that the Green New Deal becomes reality?
Yeah, climate has got to be interwoven into everything that we do. I am thrilled that President Biden is going to put us back into the Paris Accord on day one of his presidency. And as we look at doing an infrastructure package that this country so needs, not just our roads and bridges, but how are we extending broadband to every community, whether that's urban, suburban, or rural? How are we making sure that our kids can connect? And how are we putting into an infrastructure bill investment in renewable energy, making sure that what we are building is building resiliency and addressing climate change with the urgency that this problem deserves? That's the work that we did in the Moving Forward bill that the House passed back in June. That gives us a blueprint for how to move forward. And there are many wonderful pieces, even in the omnibus, that we are hoping to complete today or tomorrow, that will begin to lay a ground for us to address this existential threat to our planet and to our existence. So it is just such a difference to know that we are going to have an administration coming in that is going to lead us with science and with facts and with an acknowledgement of not only, climate change, but that we have to follow science to be able to stop this pandemic and prepare ourselves for the next threat to our health, and to finally make healthcare in this country a right and not a privilege just for some.
I want to get in a couple more questions about the agenda before I go to questions from our audience. But one question from our audience is on gun control. The question is, will gun safety and violence be on the agenda? It seems like not that long ago that you were sitting in on the floor of the House alongside the late Congressman John Lewis and others. How high on your priority list is gun control now, and what are the chances of some movement in that area?
Yeah, this is an issue that over 90% of Americans across political ideologies agree. Let's have universal background checks. Let's start there. And we can close the Charleston loophole too, which allowed the shooter in that horrific case to get a gun by manipulating our background checks. We passed that as our second bill back in February of 2019. And it, along with 400 pieces of legislation, has been collecting dust on Mitch McConnell's desk. But it's a new day, and it's going to be a new day in Washington. And making sure that the security of the American people is the top priority is going to include addressing common sense solutions that can reduce gun violence in our communities. And so we will be putting that legislation forward again. And we look forward to President Biden and Kamala Harris signing that legislation and telling the American people that they've seen the tragedies. They know how gun violence has played out so horrifically in our communities with our neighbors, and that there are common sense steps that we can take together and that we will come this new administration.
And what about healthcare and the fight for both access and to lower costs? One of our audience members asked, do you have ideas that can address both affordability and access? What will that look like? Will it look like Medicare for all? Will it look like Obamacare? What will it look like?
Well, one thing we're going to stop is the direct assault on the ACA that this administration has been waging. I referenced it earlier, but just stop to think about it. In the middle of a pandemic, this administration and many of my colleagues across the aisle joined in support, took a case to the Supreme Court to try and take away ACA, which would impact over 20 million Americans. So we're going to change course on healthcare and make sure that we are expanding, not contracting people's ability to have health insurance so they can access the care they deserve and need. And one of the many inequities that has been brought into stark relief by this pandemic is healthcare disparities for communities of color. And we have seen it play out in such a lethal way in communities of color and the disproportionate lives lost to this pandemic. But that is just one piece of the story. So let's expand healthcare. Let's put the research into healthcare disparities and the funding where it needs to be so that we end those in this country. Let's think about Joe Biden has proposed rolling out a public option. We have seen some of what happens to people in this pandemic when they lose that ability to have employer-based health insurance. Let's give them a way to not lose coverage for things that are completely out of their control. It is long past time that we make sure that everyone in this country has access to care. And that principle that healthcare is a right is going to be one that we follow through. And we are going to be so grateful to have Joe Biden and Kamala Harris help us in this work and partner with us to expand healthcare and make it more fair and just for communities of color.
So a lot of questions that I received from our audience have to do with your colleagues on the other side of the aisle. One is, how do you engage the Republicans to get support for your agenda? Even, I mean, you talked about the Senate races in Georgia. Even if the Democrats win both of those seats, that's still a 50-50 split. The House has a slimmer majority of Democrats than it had before. You're going to need Republicans to get things done. How do you propose Democrats do that?
Well, I am hoping that even if we don't control the Senate, that having the chaos and the misinformation that we have had to deal with on not just a daily, but on an hourly basis coming out of this White House is going to clear the air and make it possible to once again put the American people first And so here's how I see it. Not only, there's often talk about like, well, isn't this really a Democratic issue? And as a proud progressive, we hear, well, this is something that only the left likes. But we know that there is broad support across this country for raising the minimum wage. We saw that play out in November in Florida. We know that there is broad support for reducing the costs of prescription drugs and making sure that people have coverage so they don't have to choose between food and the medication they may need. We know there is broad support for clean air and clean water and making sure that we are addressing those issues of environmental justice. So these are issues that naturally should bring the GOP with us. And we're going to continue to extend our hand and say, let's put the American people first. And let's make sure that we are creating great jobs in our infrastructure bill and that we're also meeting those needs of addressing climate change and creating a green revolution and all the economic gain that we can have by being leaders again in renewable energy and the jobs that that will bring. So I think there is so much space for us to come together if the GOP is able to once again bring itself back to the needs of the American people. And at this particular time in our country, there is so much suffering. And I have to say that last week, while we are debating, trying to negotiate and push the Republicans in the Senate to get to yes for sending emergency relief to the American people, to see 126 of my House members and the GOP in Congress sign up to say, let's call our fair elections, the root of our democracy, into question and join a lawsuit, not to help the American people, but to help Donald Trump. So as Donald Trump exits the political stage, I hope that they will return with us to an agenda that puts the suffering of American people, their security in their lives and their livelihoods first again. And I think I look to my experience coming into Congress when I was the most junior member of the minority party. But I found ways to work across the aisle, especially around the opioid crisis, because it didn't care if you're in a red state or a blue state or how you voted. And so it was an equal opportunity and continues to be an equal opportunity killer. And so we could use that experience to work for people to find them solutions. And I hope that we can build on that work and say, now we have this pandemic that doesn't care where you live, how much money you have. It can devastate you and it can take your life and leave you with long-lasting health conditions, as we are learning. So let's come together, defeat this virus, and rebuild an economy that works for every single community in this country. And I think if we focus again on bringing solutions to American families, we are going to have bipartisanship as a natural outcome of that work.
Okay, we only have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to lightning round through as many of our
Okay.
questions as we can. One of them you teed up perfectly, talking about the 126 Republicans who supported the president's false claim that the election was unfair or that he won. The question is, do you feel the House Republicans supporting Trump's denial of losing the election should be censured?
I really want to bring our focus, back to the work at hand. But I do think that we have a responsibility as members of Congress and our constitutional responsibility to oversight, to make sure that we are looking at the lessons that we've learned from the last 4 years and making sure that we are strengthening our democracy and our constitutional role as Congress, so that if another president came who didn't abide by the rule of law, didn't respect the rule of law, didn't respect our Constitution, put the security of our country behind his own political ambitions, that we are better prepared and that we look at our system and where we can strengthen it to make sure that we are protecting our democracy and those ideals that we talk about equality and liberty and justice for all, and make that for all our emphasis point. So, the actions of those 126 are just so cynical and dangerous to me. But at this time, it is the American people that have to be our priority. And whether it's delivering them this emergency aid that they desperately need us to do this week, or putting them back in focus so that we can get their health back and get their economy back under them, is going to be the critical focus of our work.
And related to the election, one of our audience members writes, how do you plan to address gerrymandering and voter suppression?
Yeah, well, House 1 is going to be our first bill again, at least in our top bills, which is the bill that we put forward to protect voting rights, to root out corruption, to bring transparency into who is funding our elections to the American people. And we have to build on that and make sure that that right to vote is restored for every single American who is eligible to vote, because it is fundamental to how we go forward. And we have seen far too much of voter suppression, of calling into question fair elections. The only fraud that happened in this election is Donald Trump.
And several of our viewers, of our audience members asked a version of this question. That'll be the final one. It's about essential workers and really protecting them specifically, whether it's getting them hazard pay or doing emergency action to help them pay for childcare. Speak specifically to the frontline workers who have been working, who are more likely, as you said, to be women, a lot of people of color. What special protections are you pushing for them specifically as we emerge from this pandemic?
Well, you just named some really good ones, or whoever asked this question. Hazard pay, absolutely, I support that. I think we have to recognize frontline essential workers and what they've been through and what we've asked them to do. We have to make sure that they get the vaccine. And that's not just our healthcare workers, although they are critical, but let's make sure our childcare providers have the vaccine. Let's make sure that our grocery store workers and people who help us in takeout restaurants also have access to a life-saving vaccine. And we have to look at our economy, look at all those issues. With over half of our essential workers being women, we have to have national policies around paid leave and family leave that is expanded. Let's make sure that the paid leave we expanded within the CARES Act that is set to expire not only doesn't expire, but becomes permanent, so that people don't have to make the choice between going to work sick, sending their children to school sick, and having a paycheck to pay the bills. These are the sort of policies that we need, and we need to make sure that we are starting with these essential workers and finally recognizing the value of their work and how critical it is to all of us getting through the pandemic. And if we're serious about rebuilding a new and inclusive economy, it starts with their work and putting these policies and protections in place.
All right, well, that familiar buzzer is a reminder to all of us that the work on Capitol Hill goes on.
That's right.
And so I thank you for taking the time at this busy time to speak with us today. Congresswoman Catherine Clark from the 5th Congressional District of Massachusetts. Thank you again.
Thank you, Kimberly, and to everyone. I hope you stay well and have a joyous and happy holidays. And we look forward to 2021 and brighter days ahead. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us, and thanks to all of our audience members. You can stay tuned to our Boston Globe Op Talks page to see upcoming events. And in the meantime, happy holidays and be well. Bye-bye.